Well, thank you. I'd like to thank Angie Jones and the University of Toledo Family Business Center for inviting me to present this talk on the occasion of your annual meeting. It's really an honor to have been asked. And I know no other place more appropriate to give this talk than here in the Glass Pavilion. Without the glass industry, there would be no Toledo Museum of Art. And without the museum's connection to the glass industry, there would be no Glass Pavilion. Not only are we here among one of the finest collections of art glass in the world, but we are literally in the shadow of the home of the man who made all of this possible, Edward Drummond Libby, which his house is right over here on the corner. His home has been designated a National Historic Landmark, the only building with such a designation in Toledo, and one of only 2 properties in all of Northwest Ohio. My book, The Glass City, Toledo and the Industry That Built It, is an effort to connect the histories of the companies that have been a foundation of Toledo's economic development with the history of the city itself. And if you should doubt the impact of glass on Toledo, you need only imagine for a moment what the city would have been like without Edward Drummond Libby and his successors and all they made possible. If you take a drive through the downtown, you will see that the tallest buildings that dot our skyline are those that once housed the corporate offices of Toledo's glass companies. From the top floors of the buildings on Madison Avenue, the Fiberglass Tower, and One Seagate, the corporate leaders of Toledo Glass shaped the city's physical landscape, exercised control over huge aspects of our economy, and held sway over the decisions of political leaders. But the companies did more than just bring great wealth to their leaders. They also brought prosperity and a path to the middle class to tens of thousands of Toledoans. While today the glass industry may play a smaller role in Toledo, the common history between the city and the industry forever binds the 2 together and should not be forgotten. Tonight I want to talk not just about the impact of glass on Toledo. I also want to discuss the impact of Toledo's glass on the world. In conducting the research for my book, it became clear that that Toledo Glass fundamentally changed many aspects of modern life, from what we eat and drink, to the architecture of our homes and cities, to where we live, to our ability to explore our universe, and even to our forms of artistic expression. In this talk, I want to focus on just a few of the ways in which the Toledo glass industry and its products have impacted us. And by us, I mean the global community. But before I get to that topic, it is important to remember just how Toledo became the glass city. For that story, we need to go back to 20 years before the industry came here, and to this man, Jessup W. Scott, who, among other things, was the founder of what would become the University of Toledo. In 1868, Scott, who owned much of the land that became downtown Toledo, published an article in a business-related periodical of the day entitled The Future Great City of the World. In this article, Scott looked at the geography of the United States and determined that the biggest city in the world by the beginning of the 20th century was likely to be Toledo, Ohio. It was going to be bigger than Paris, London, or New York. Scott's vision clearly influenced Toledo's founding fathers, who from that moment on believed the city was destined for greatness. Much of the city's early economic development was an effort to find the magic bullet that would propel us to that destiny. But finding that magic bullet was not easy. Toledo's geography was really the opposite of a place that seemed destined to become the center of the universe. It was, rather, in the middle of a disease-infested swamp. Because it was hard to get to and difficult to live in once you arrived, few businesses and industries were created in the early years of the city's development. To attract industry, city fathers felt the first necessary element that was required for Toledo to meet its destiny was a cheap energy source like natural gas, which had been found in large deposits in areas south of Toledo. So investors began a desperate search for natural gas underneath the city. Unfortunately, they could not find a source, but they did succeed in building a pipeline that would bring natural gas here from areas outside of the city. On September 7, 1887, to celebrate the completion of a gas pipeline that would serve as a lifeline to new economic development, Toledo held a gas celebration. That evening, they opened up all of the natural gas standpipes around the city and lit them, and the fires could be seen for miles. An article in the paper the next day described the event in this way, quote, "By burning jets of natural gas, by brilliant flames from mammoth gushers, by the roar from the combined force of 40 wells, thousands of strangers and citizens read last night the destiny of Toledo. Toledo, the queen city of the lake, goes forth conquering, bearing a torch with light for the world, with fire for a nation's forges, with heat for a million looms, with fuel for thousands of factories." Cheap and plentiful fuel was a requirement for successful glass manufacturing, as Edward Drummond Libby knew all too well. Libby had not wanted a career in the glass industry. He actually wanted to become a minister. But in 1883, when his father died in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he took over the company, his company, the New England Glass Company. His father, William, had struggled to make the company one of the oldest glass manufacturers in the country, successful against difficult odds. The old glass companies of the East Coast were competing in the 1880s with newer manufacturers in places like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, which were located close to the coal mines that fed the glass furnaces. Coal was expensive to ship to New England. The Libbys also faced high labor costs from unionized, skilled tradesmen who were among the highest paid workers in the country. So when promoters from the Toledo Businessmen's Committee began to advertise in newspapers around the country their desire to attract companies to Toledo that could make use of large deposits of cheap natural gas, it's not surprising that Edward Drummond Libby was interested. In reality, he probably had no choice but to move the company if it was going to survive. So in 1888, Libby, attracted by money and land to build a new factory and cheap fuel to run it, packed up his company, machinery, and workers, and brought them by train to Toledo, Ohio. The arrival of Libby and his workers to Toledo was a cause for celebration, the likes of which the city had never seen before or since. Their train was met by city fathers and grateful citizens, and there were speeches, a parade, and a picnic. The city's destiny as the future great city of the world seemed to be riding on the shoulders of this young man from Boston. Unfortunately, the first year of that company's existence in Toledo did not go well. The cheap natural gas Libby was promised was much more expensive than advertised. The glass batch formulas that had worked in Massachusetts to make the brilliant colored glass that the company was known for did not work in Toledo. Worst of all, many of the skilled workers were not happy living in uncivilized Toledo and returned to Boston, where life was a little more refined, and you can see those fine, refined men right there. To replace his workers, Libby went to the glass factories of West Virginia. He recruited a man who had been working in those factories since he was 10 years old, named Michael Owens. Owens took over as supervisor at Libby's factory in Toledo and immediately fired most of the men working there because they lacked a discipline, replacing them with men he could trust. And you can see Mr. Owens there in that great coat right in the middle of the picture. Owens was also placed in charge of an extremely risky $250,000 endeavor that Libby had undertaken in an effort to build a national brand for his company, a working glass furnace at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. While the Libby Pavilion at the fair seemed foolish to many of Libby's investors, it became a great success. After paying back his investors, the World's Columbian Exposition earned Libby a profit of over $100,000. money that Libby could now plow back into his Toledo factory with a special eye towards automation. And that brings us to the story of the first innovation in glass developed in Toledo that would change the world, the automatic bottle machine. While Michael Owens lacked much formal education, he knew everything about glass technology because he'd been working in the industry for over 20 years when he came to Libby Glass. At the time, each glass bottle was made by hand, and the process had changed little since ancient times. The blower would gather up just about the right amount of 2400-degree molten glass from a furnace with a blowpipe. A young boy would hold the mold around the hot glass, and the blower would blow into it. The boy would open the mold and take out the red-hot bottle, and it would be passed on to a finisher who would shape the neck. Another boy would remove any excess glass from the bottle in the mold, and a fourth boy would take the bottle to the annealing layer, where it would slowly cool. Working 10-hour shifts, a typical shop could produce about 300 bottles a day. Because the furnaces had to be kept running, the boys, who were denigrated and called blowers' dogs, worked all hours of the day and night. Owens himself had worked 2 shifts each day in the glass factories when he was a child. Sometimes the children were forced to work against their will, having been gathered up from poorhouses and orphanages. They were paid by the piece. They were often physically and verbally abused. And as you can imagine, the work was dangerous. Because of its primitive production processes, the glass bottle industry was the largest employer of child labor of any industry in the country at the turn of the century, with children making up 24% of the workforce. This was the life that Michael Owens knew as a child. Perhaps because of his personal history, he returned to Toledo from his success running the glass furnaces at the World's Columbian Exposition and began to experiment with methods to automate bottle production. The first successful prototype was produced in 1894. It had 6 arms and worked much like a person hand blowing a glass bottle. Molten glass was sucked up into the bottle mold, and then a blast of air forced it down into the mold to make a hollow bottle. A pot of molten glass rotated around the machine, and Owens worked to ensure that the glass batch was always figured in the same manner and kept at the same temperature to produce consistent bottles. The machine did not require a skilled blower to operate. In 1895, Libby, seeking to invest in Owens's innovations, created a brand new company called the Toledo Glass Company, exclusively to work on perfecting Owens's work in glass automation. And I should note here that all of the photos and documents that you see in this slide presentation are things that are preserved in the Wardham Canaday Center in our university library. So this is an incredible collection of rare materials that document this very important industry, not only to Toledo, but to the world. The Owens bottle machine was patented in 1903. It was described as the most important innovation in glass manufacturing in over 2,000 years, and it quickly became the industry standard. The Owens bottle machine dramatically reduced the cost of bottle production to basically just the cost of raw ingredients. It cut in half the workforce of skilled bottle blowers employed nationwide from 8,000 to 4,000. It reduced the wages of those who remained to the point that the American Flint Glass Workers Union actually considered trying to buy up all of the machines in order to protect their livelihoods. Because every bottle was exactly alike, it made possible the large-scale automatic bottling of beverages, transforming soda and liquor brands from locally produced products into international corporations. The influence of the Owens bottle machine was not just nationally, it was globally. Within 10 years, the Owens bottle machine was making bottles in England, France, Germany, Holland, Austria, Sweden, Norway, and Hungary. But perhaps most importantly, from a humane perspective, by 1919, the number of children employed in the glass industry was reduced from 24% to less than 2%. This was not the last innovation of Michael Owens that would change the lives of people around the world, however. In 1912, the Toledo Glass Company, at Owens's request, successfully bid on patents being sold at a bankruptcy auction for a new way of making flat glass. The patents developed by Irving Colburn of Massachusetts were for a process that continuously made glass that was of uniform thickness and distortion-free by drawing molten glass between a series of rollers. While the process seemed simple enough, it was actually modeled after the way paper is made in paper mills. Colburn was never able to perfect the machine, and without any more money from investors, he was forced to sell his invention. Owens convinced Edward Drummond Libby that the machine could easily be perfected and would result in an entirely new product line for Libby, flat glass. Prior to Colburn's invention, flat glass was generally produced in one of two methods: by blowing a large cylinder and then splitting it along the side and flattening it out, which produced distortions. Or the other way was by pouring molten glass into molds and then polishing and sanding it until it was of even thickness and clarity. The latter method was employed in the factory built by Edward Ford in Rossford in 1899. Owens was particularly interested in the Colburn process because of the demand for glass by the new automotive industry. While distortions in glass were acceptable for stationary windows in buildings, it was not so in moving cars, where even small distortions adversely impacted the ability of the driver to see. While the Colburn process seemed simple on paper, it required an investment of almost $1 million by Libby and the Toledo Glass Company to perfect. The new company formed to produce flat glass using the Colburn process was called the Libby Owens Sheet Glass Company. You can see the conveyor there, where once the process begins, once the furnace is lit and fires up, it's just a continuous 24/7 rolling off of the conveyor sheet glass. But Owens was not just interested in making clear window glass to be used in automobile windshields. He was interested in making safe glass. So he convinced Libby to build a new plant on the east side of Toledo to make laminated glass, which consisted of 2 sheets of glass sandwiched together with a polymer between that would not shatter in sharp pieces when broken. Early automobiles did not have safety glass in windshields, and Owens was convinced this was to become the industry standard. Unfortunately, Owens did not live to see safety glass become the industry standard because he died in 1923 after suffering a heart attack while attending a board meeting of his bottle machine company. He continued until the day he died to tinker with both the Colburn flat glass machine and the Owens bottle machine. In 1930, a company formed from the merger of the Libby Owens Sheet Glass Company and the Ford Plate Glass Company of Rossford would be called Libby Owens Ford for over 70 years, and it would win the exclusive contract for supplying all window glass for automobiles made by General Motors. In 1934, General Motors bowed to pressure from the glass industry to make safety glass the standard in all automobile windows and cars it sold. Prior to this time, it was possible to buy cars that only had safety glass in the front windshield, and anything extra, if you wanted it in the rest of the windows, would have been an extra cost. Imagine a world in which cars did not have safety glass. This is another way in which products produced by Toledo glass manufacturers changed history. But that was not the last of important innovations in the flat glass produced by Libby Owens Ford. In 1934, the company purchased the patents for insulated window glass, a product called thermopane. After spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to perfect it, they finally succeeded in making windows that consisted of 2 panes of glass held together on the edges with space between that made the windows more energy efficient. Prior to this time, buildings were built with drafty single-paned windows. Consider the way that this product changed our lives. It made possible the type of homes that did not overheat in the summer and that were kept warm in the winter because of the insulated glass. In the late 1950s, Libby Owens Ford developed a type of insulated structural glass that was so strong it actually helped to hold buildings together. Tough Flex glass by LOF made possible the modern skyscraper. Architects could build taller and taller steel structures for buildings because the glass that skimmed the outside was integral to the stability of the building. LOF showed off its products in its own new headquarters building, constructed in 1960 on Madison Avenue in Toledo. Not only did the structural glass keep the building together, but its insulating properties made it possible to control the temperature of the building without opening windows. In 1970, LOF glass was used to build the tallest buildings in the world at the time, the World Trade Center in New York. When you think about the tragic end of those buildings, you gain a deeper appreciation for what an important structural component the glass was to their stability. I would now like to return to the other company which Michael Owens created, the Owens Bottle Company, and another innovation that impacted the world. After Owens's death, followed by the death of Edward Drummond Libby 2 years later, the Owens Bottle Company merged with the Illinois Glass Company of Alton, Illinois, to create Owens, Illinois in 1929. The company struggled to survive in its early years, largely because in 1919, Congress passed something called the Volstead Act, which became the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, transport, import, export of alcohol that was bottled in Owens, Illinois bottles. William Levis, who took over as president of the company at the time of the merger, sought to diversify the product line and also develop products that could make use of the excess production capacity at its bottle plants. Shutting down a large-scale glass plant is not easy to do, and Levis preferred to figure out a way to use the furnaces. The first new product the company produced was glass block. Glass blocks were invented by Owens, Illinois, and sold as a replacement for masonry brick. Unlike brick, glass blocks could be used to construct buildings that would allow in light, and they also provided insulation. To show off its new product, OI built a temporary building at the Century of Progress exhibition, a World's Fair held in Chicago in 1934. In 1937, it built this building on Westwood Avenue in Toledo, which was used as a technical center. But the company struggled with one aspect of this new product. Glass blocks were constructed by joining two halves together so that there was insulating space in the middle. The halves were joined by a thin bead of molten glass. But sometimes making that thin bead did not work, and instead only thin glass fibers were produced. Levis thought that these fibers, if they could be produced in large quantity and with consistent quality, might have an industrial application. So he hired a couple of engineers to experiment by making glass fibers, including Dr. Games Slater. Slater, along with John Thomas and scientists from the Corning Glass Works of New York, began experimenting at a new facility in Newark, Ohio. And finally, in 1937, they came up with a production method. But then the question became, what do you do with this product? By this time, Owens, Illinois, and Corning Glass had invested millions in fiberglass and had little to show. In 1938, Levis decided to spin off this aspect of OI as a separate entity that would have to succeed on its own. He chose Harold Bechenstein, a friend he had brought with him to Toledo from Illinois, to head the new company that was created to exploit glass fiber technology. The new company was called Owens Corning Fiberglass, and that's the first board of directors meeting there in that picture. Today, fiberglass is fundamental to modern living and is used in thousands of products we use every day. But at the time, finding a use for fiberglass was a challenge. The first product was a furnace filter called Dust Stop that was used in forced air furnaces that were being incorporated into many new homes, replacing radiator heat. The filter consisted of a mat of fiberglass encased between two thin metal screens. After some experimenting, Owens Corning began to use the metal sheets that were left over after bottle caps were punched out as the screens for the furnace filters. It's probably something a lot of you will remember, that look. They also developed a form of insulation using glass fibers, which was heavily used by the military in World War II. After the war, the company began manufacturing other types of consumer goods, including cloth woven out of fiberglass that was used to make curtains. The curtains not only provided additional insulation to those large picture windows in 1950s homes, but they was also used in auditoriums and public theaters because they were flame resistant. The impact of fiberglass has been immense. In the post-war housing boom of the 1950s, Owens Corning worked with the Federal Housing Administration to improve insulation in new home construction, designing a house that could be heated and cooled for $10 per month. The insulation that Owens Corning sold made the development of cities and suburbs in previously uninhabitable places in the United States possible, places like Texas and New Mexico and Southern California. The company continued to work on improvements to its insulation product line, and in 1956, it added red dye to the binder formula to differentiate an older type of insulation from its new formula. That changed the color of the insulation to that which is distinctive and recognizable to almost anyone today, pink. The insulation and fire-resistant characteristics led fiberglass to be added to other products to make them stronger, and an entirely new industry of composite materials was created. Fiberglass was added to shingles to improve their insulation properties, to plastics to make them stronger, used to make boats because it was lighter, and in 1953, to make the body of a brand new sports car called the Corvette because it was sleeker, lighter, and faster. In 1967, a national tragedy spurred its use in a whole new line of products, the spacesuits of astronauts. That year, the Apollo space mission was inaugurated with the goal of landing a man on the moon. But in a test command module where astronauts Virgil Grisham, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were practicing a launch simulation, the nearly 100% oxygen atmosphere in the capsule suddenly caught fire, and the capsule was quickly consumed by flames before the astronauts could open the escape hatch. All three died, and some feared the tragedy would end the country's effort to go to the moon. In hearings convened by Congress, it was decided that all fabrics in space capsules should be made of fire-resistant materials. Beta cloth, a fabric made of woven fiberglass that was coated in Teflon, was selected for use in making the spacesuits of men who would eventually walk on the moon. Fiberglass-coated materials were also used to cover many sports venues. In 1978, such fabrics were utilized in building one of the most unusual buildings ever constructed, the airport near Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where millions travel each year in a pilgrimage. Fiberglass was also used in the 1970s to insulate the Alaskan oil pipeline, which was the largest insulation project ever at the time of its construction, thus proving fiberglass use in the Arctic as well as the desert. Toledo Glass was also instrumental in the development of the solar energy industry. As early as the 1960s, Libby Owens Ford in Owens, Illinois began to experiment in using their products to make solar collectors. While neither company saw much success with this new product line, one of LOF's engineers, a man named Harold McMaster, went on to become a pioneer in the solar panel industry. His company, Solar Cells, Inc., became First Solar, one of the largest makers of solar panels today. But it's not just the products of Toledo Glass companies that have changed our world. The profits of the Libby Glass Company made possible one of the most important cultural institutions. In 1901, even before the invention of the automatic bottle machine, Edward Drummond Libby was already moving from his vocation of glass manufacturing to his avocation, art collecting. On April 18, 1901, Libby and a group of Toledo artists founded the Toledo Museum of Art. He spent much of the rest of his life traveling the world with his wife, Florence Scott Libby, granddaughter of Jessup W. Scott, purchasing works of art for the museum. Upon his death in 1925, a large share of his fortune was given to the museum as a permanent endowment that has continued over the years to allow the museum to purchase important additions to the collection. It has also provided for free admission to the museum. Libby appreciated that glass could be more than just utilitarian, it could also be art. Beginning in 1913, Libby began to purchase glass to be part of the museum's permanent collection, beginning with 80 pieces of European glassware. In 1951, Owens, Illinois, who at the time owned Libby Glass, donated to the museum an amazing collection of brilliant cut and etched glass that had been produced by the company, include many items that had been displayed in the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. These pieces are still on display today in the Glass Pavilion. I hope you take a look at them before you leave this evening. And there is one last way in which Toledo glass has contributed to our cultural world and artistic expression. In 1962, Toledo Museum of Art director Otto Whitman invited Harry Littleton, a ceramics artist, to come to Toledo to experiment in making glass art pieces. Littleton teamed with Dominic Labino, a Toledo glass engineer, to make a small glass furnace in a garage on the grounds of the museum that could be used by glass artists in ways that did not require a large industrial glass furnace. Thus began the studio glass movement. The techniques developed by Littleton and Labino are still used by glass artists to create beautiful pieces of art that are renowned and desired by collectors worldwide. And of course, there is an example of such a glass furnace right here in the Glass Pavilion. I would like you to consider just how important Edward Drummond Libby's arrival in Toledo was and how the city fathers at the time had, in some sense, recognized how important this man would be to the city's future. On January 12, 1888, the year that Libby came to Toledo, the Toledo Blade ran a story that imagined what Toledo would be like in 1999. It would be a grand place that would indeed be the greatest city of the world. Quote, "The remarkable growth of our city during the past century has been one of the marvels of the world. Starting 111 years ago as a little country village of 100,000 inhabitants, it has steadily grown to its present population of over 6 million. Only one city, New York, now rivals its numbers. London, Paris, and cities of the East have one after another been left behind." The article went on to describe how Detroit would be Toledo's northern suburb and portions of Canada would be annexed to the city. We all recognize today that Toledo did not become Jessup Scott's dream of the great city of the world. But Toledo glass in some ways did succeed in meeting Scott's destiny. As I state in the introduction to my book, quote, "Toledo glass was used to make the spacesuits of astronauts who landed on the moon in 1969, and it was used by Admiral Richard E. Byrd in scientific experiments he conducted at the South Pole in the 1930s. It covers the airport in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where millions of Muslims come each year in their pilgrimage to pray, and it encased the towers of the World Trade Center. It protected America's Declaration of Independence in the National Archives, and it has been used by revolutionaries around the world to convey their beliefs with Molotov cocktails. It has held the punch served at receptions in the White House, and the alcohol in the brown bags of paupers on street corners everywhere. It insulated the Alaskan oil pipeline, and it is used in solar energy panels. It is displayed in some of the finest art museums in the world, and every day it is tossed into garbage pits. It literally surrounds us in our windows, our walls, and our roofs, and it holds our water as well as our wine. And that is an impressive heritage of innovation that I think we can all be proud of. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Well, I hope before you leave today, you'll take a look around the museum and see some of the examples of this real glass that I've been talking about, and just think about how much what we do today is the result of the innovation that began way back in 1888. It's just been an amazing achievement for our city and for these amazingly innovative leaders. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. That was fascinating. That was really interesting. I think the topic for this event came about when I was hosting that conference this summer, someone had said, "Hey, why is Toledo the Glass City?" And I'm like, I don't really know. Maybe other people don't know either. So that was really, really interesting. Thank you. We did record this, and we will post it online. It's a great story if you want to share it with anyone. So thank you again to everyone for joining us tonight. I should have said earlier that on the tables are some unique sculptures, some unique glass pieces that were done by students here at the Education Center over here in the Glass Pavilion. So if you hadn't noticed it or you want to take a minute and kind of look around, I think they have little stories about who they were and what the pieces mean to them. So again, a big thank you to everyone for coming. A big thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Barbara. And I hope thank you to Jim Kenzie for recording this for us. And I hope you all have a safe and wonderful holiday.